When we look at the past, when we look at our history, we realise there really are many mysteries out there. But that's the most fascinating thing. It makes us more inquisitive to our universe and the things that are happening around us, and certainly what our ancestors saw and described. So in asking questions, I'm sure there are going to be many questions for this presentation it's going to bring up to you. You'll be likely asking the same questions as I did. Why? Who? How? When? What? Really? I'm not naive to think that I've answered all the questions here. That's the best part. There's so many questions about this. But we hope by the end of the presentation you are suitably filled with a little bit of knowledge, a little bit more knowledge, and the appetite to go and look, and enthusiasm to go and learn more. So this really was the beginning of the talk I wrote during 2012 and delivered to the Nottingham Empyrean Society. And basically it's a combination of a number of data and things I was looking at for a period of time. The title of the presentation I gave back then was Large Sunken Islands, Tales of Ancient Gods, Pre-Celtic History and Sacred Artifacts, Earth Mysteries, Ancient Mythology, Technology of the Gods, and the strong connection between all of them. I really did try at the time to sum it up as a title that was smaller, but nothing ever seemed to cover it or convey it properly, hence the extended title, which I hope you don't mind, but it had to cover every base that we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the ancient culture of people that came to Ireland, Western Scotland, England and Wales, and what caused them to come from a drowning land, bringing with them what appear to be the artifacts and tools that populate our myths and legends, whilst looking deeply into the godly abilities that may have something to do more with technology than spiritual will alone. So where do we start? Where do we start, indeed? Honestly, this has to be the most difficult part of all the information I have to prepare, and to describe the correct passage of time, and to be honest I can't do it, without exploring on digressions to fill in the information that we hope will provide a fuller picture. And this is where we begin. Now, to put forward that our history is skewed, slightly skewed at least, and that based on evidence and information that it may in fact be closer to our legends, as is more painstakingly recorded by our ancestors, that they felt so compelled to write down so vividly, to write into stone, into parchment. They were describing events and occurrences in the best way of their understanding. And as with many legends, threads of truth shine like a beacon, begging and teasing for a closer inspection. So we split our presentation into 3 acts to support this. Act 1. Tuatha Dé Danann. When it comes to the Tuatha Dé Danann, which you may or may not have heard of, there are 3 important questions you have to ask. Where is what we know about them come from? What do we know about them, and who are they? So where does what we know about them come from? We know of the Tuatha Dé Danann because it comes from a number of sources and manuscripts, such as the Book of Leinster, which is a manuscript of 187 pages that we will call a compilation detail of great battles, historical confrontations, agreements, genealogy of ancient kings, and history, which came together in 1160 by U. D. Corinthian, who was a historian and a monk at the Tuatha Dé Danann monastery, which is today called Tipperary. The Liber de Hudri, which is a compilation of 36 volumes and is currently held by the Royal Irish Academy and can be read online, as well as the Liber de Gabaréren. Another key source is the Liber de Lichen, or the Yellow Book of Lichen, which is a medieval manuscript of 344 volumes of text, and this was compiled in 1391, which contains some of the works that are in the Liber de Hudri and in the Book of Leinster in variant forms. And these are all interconnected, as they effectively support and expand upon each other. So where do they come from? These stories, the legends and the history that have transcended through oral stories and the traditions of the people, it accounts that the Irish people can, amongst their ancestors, a race of tall white people called the Tuatha Dé Danann, the children, the tribes, the people of Danu. They are presented in the history of the Irish legendary stories of being gods, demigods, originally from the stars, that they came with a sense of profound understanding and ideology. They had a number of unique skills, and namely that they brought language. Interestingly it is, we are told that their homeland, Tir Nanog, which sank under the waves during a catastrophic flood. Now this here is a picture of a modern map of the UK and the Atlantic, and there is no island northwest of Ireland. Now in the stories of the Fir Bolg, it says they fought a water-bound enemy from the west, But of course, as the picture demonstrates, there is no landmass to the west and northwest of Scotland, an island. Now, castles and fortifications. When Tin and Og went beneath the waves, the Tuatha Dé Danann dispersed in fleets of ships, eventually settling in Ireland, western Scotland, and western England. There exists a large number of castles and forts, many of which have no recorded age, history, or stories even attached to them. They are not in their few either. Many are located along the coastline, indeed out into the sea, which many are underwater. These fortifications were built against attacks from the sea. This is a slide of Dunatar Castle and Argonautica. A couple of photos here. This is the one on the right is Argonautica, which his name is strikingly interesting because it's not considered to be an Irish, Gaelic, or Celtic, but its syntax and its pronunciation is actually, according to Charles Hoth, who was an independent language expert I spoke with in 2010, he said it sounded more like it came from Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq and Kuwait. And even that piqued his interest to go and find out more himself. Unfortunately, I've not been able to get in contact with him since then. In The Mysterious Worlds, which is on the show, written by Arthur C. Clarke, who was the author of numerous books, including the 4 Odyssey books, 2001: Space Odyssey being the first. Arthur interviewed archaeologists, historians, and chemists, and they were exploring the history and mystery of these forts and castles. And one such comment from the archaeologist of the Natural History Museum, who was uncredited on the show, says, "Just in Scotland alone, there are well over 100 structures, and of the 100 or so, there are 20 that maybe we know anything about. Over 60 of these have been subject to the process of vitrification, and how this is done is unknown." This is Tapu North. Tapu North is possibly the most well-known of the unknown castles and forts. Here is evidence of vitrification, which is the melting of rock to a molten magma state and then has rehardened. Now, if you know the melting point of rock, now of course that's going to be dependent on things like minerals contained pressures, but ballpark figures estimate it's between 670 degrees and 1400 degrees Celsius. So the mineral structure here is black schist, phyllite, flint, and a thin band of thermite limestone and quartz. Now, vitrification, as the archaeologist on the show stated, that there are 60 of these castles that have been subjected to the process of vitrification, and how this has been done is unknown. There are only 3 ways of solid rock of reaching the temperature required to vitrify. First is a volcano. To vitrify means is literally turn the stone into its liquid magma state. The other is the heart of a nuclear detonation. And there's another technology that we're actually getting to grips with, which is a solid-state laser that is currently being developed by Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and was unveiled in April 2012. But of course, direct energy beam weapons, lasers, back in those days, that's very silly. Admittedly, there have been tests using fire, there have been tests using processes of heating the rocks to see if they can achieve the same process of vitrification. Unfortunately, all of those experiments failed. And they did, in fact, demonstrate that if you were to use the process of putting wood inside the rock walls and then they were to vitrify, it actually would weaken the walls. So they thought that this discovery proved that they didn't use vitrification to make the walls stronger, because it actually made them weaker. And an interesting fact is that many of these forts have 2 entrances, one to the north of east and one to the south of west, which suggests that there was some kind of sun ceremonial significance to the people who were using them. Unfortunately, no information remains, so what we know is just speculation. The real mystery is dating them. The dating assigned to them puts them to be built in the Neolithic era. That's 9,500 BC to around 6,000 BC. Mainstream accepted history says the only people of this time in this area were early travelling hunter-gatherers, perhaps forerunners to the Picts. Yet there are over 100 of these castles, built as mass structures, defending attacks against sea-bound enemies, of which their aggressors had the ability to melt rock. In the Book of Leinster and Libar the Húdre Lycan, There's talk of another race who inhabited what is now Ireland. The Tuatha Dé Danann had an extended confrontation and battles with these, and they were called the Fomori. A race of quite barbaric, cannibalistic giants, apparently. In one story, it tells of how the tribes of Danann were beaten back by boulders, in fact, some as the size of horses, being thrown at them by the Fomori, and that they sunk many boats as they retreated to the sea. So one has to wonder, did the Fomori build the structures to defend themselves against the Tuatha Dé Danann before eventually succumbing to them, if their island was indeed sinking in a flood? So, whatever the case is, there's a complex time in history and science really hasn't recorded these events correctly. Tools and items of the gods. It is written and in legend that the Tuatha Dé Danann brought with them a number of objects and tools that were ascribed to be having magical powers and abilities, or at least appearing magical to those who were viewing them and recording them. Like today we have electricity. 200 years ago it would have been considered magic to turn on the light in a room, communicating wirelessly, levitating trains. And they brought with a number of important relics, and here's what they were. They're called the Lir, the Cauldron of Dagda, the sword weapon of Nuada, and the spear trident of Lul or Lir. Now they appear to have been brought with them. Now legends have been attached over time to their alleged abilities. So let's break these items down of the gods. So they brought with them the sword of Nuada, which has legends linking it to the romance of Excalibur. Now we know from a talk with Mark Colley that we attended a year ago now, I guess, that Excalibur, in fact, is the name of the process of Roman sword forging, called caliburn, and the understanding of it being drawn out of a stone is the final process of this iron sword forging. The romance is, in fact, the concepts it is being given to them by a lady in the lake or a goddess. It apparently is of a material not forged by man. Now, the sword of the Nuada allegedly came from the city of Gorius, the land of Tianarog. Nuada Dalgalamer. Nuada with the silver hand. He was the leader of the Tuatha Dé Danann. The sword of light glowed with a bright light and was undefeatable, and allegedly could cut foes in half. The sword of Nuada was ascribed also to being able to cast out fire and lightning. A weapon of the gods. In fact, there's many gods who are ascribed to having this power, or indeed one of these tools. The Leophile, also known as the Stone of Destiny. This stone is where the kings and queens of all history have been coronated in England, or where the ritual crowning of the monarchs has happened, and this continued until the last King George. Queen Elizabeth II was not on this stone, which is why there's a dispute over her position in the monarchy in regards to certain circles. And this stone has a legend attached to it. Amongst those, that it was one of the stones brought back from the land of Jerusalem, which may sound quite fantastical until we actually look at the history books, where we find there's a fascinating story. Teotefi, the youngest daughter of Zedekiah, king of Jerusalem, landed in Howth on the 18th of June, 583 BC, and was greeted there and carried ashore by Mac Lir and the Andri, High King of Ireland, and soon after they wed, making their pledges around what she brought with her from the Holy Land, from Jerusalem, the Stone of Destiny. Her mission was to return it to the place of the gods, which is where they wed, Catastrophic, which is now known as the Hill of Tara, a place symbiotically connected to the gods. They brought the Cauldron of Dagda. The story is regarded as the archetype of the Holy Grail stories. Also in Welsh mythology and in Celtic, this is known as the Cauldron of Rebirth. The vessel is ascribed to having healing and life-restoring properties. However, the restored ability and increased strength comes at the price of the inability of speech. And we know this because it comes to us from the Liber Dahudri, where there's an extraordinary account. In fact, it's a first-hand account of its use. It's an account similar to a journal entry, and written in the form of a poem. It is of King Breningrad Vran, written quite late in his life, as it is a reflective account. The king was in battle. In a fight, he became wounded by a cut to his upper right leg. When he called for aid, he got the Cauldron of Dagda, which he drank from, and over the course of the passing of the sun, his wound, he could no longer feel pain, and the wound had been sealed. He then was granted by the gods the strength of 10 men, but he could no longer talk. The account is reflective He's writing of the sadness at the passing of his wife and son, who he has now outlived, and that he could never say he loved them. And the last was known as the Spear of Lir, which I believe is the most interesting of all the tools that was brought with them. The holder of this spear would always be victorious, since no battle can ever be sustained against it. This spear glows as bright as being of the sun rays at midsummer. No one could look directly at it, as it rules the southern sky. It has the destructive power of the Eye of Balor within. Morphesia of the City of Phalius, the Book of Leinster. Now, a little bit of Lugh. Now, Lunasel. Catherine Dupree, a historian of Celtic and pagan history, comes an eloquent essay on the origins of the feast, and she includes a little-known and poignant myth of Lugh's foster mother, the daughter of the older race, the Fir Bolg, conquered by the Tuatha Dé Danann, the gods of Ireland. Lunasa is named for the god Lugh, the Celtic deity who presides over arts and science. According to Celtic legend, Lugh decreed that a commemorative feast be held each year at the beginning of the harvest to honour his foster mother, Taltu. Taltu was the royal lady of the Fir Bolg, and after the defeat of her people by the Tuatha Dé Danann, she was requested by them to clear a vast forest for the purpose of planting grain for the coming year, as their numbers were great. Taltu died of exhaustion in the attempt, and the legend states that she was buried beneath the great mound named for her, at the spot where the first feast of Lunasel was held in Ireland, the Hill Telte, and this is where the gathering of the hand games and the contests of skill, as well as the great feast, are made up of the first fruits of the summer harvest. The Spear Lugh, this is why I believe it's interesting, as in the script it says that the sun is the source of its energy and of its power. The Spear of Lugh is also known to have a hum, and only those who are skilled in its use can use it. And when not in use, the Spear of Lugh was kept in a vat of cool water. Now, around the world there are a multitude of spear trident, particularly trident-tipped tools, that are ascribed to having the exact description, and also their use. Octane, a serpent spear of Zhang Fei Tide of the Three Kingdoms period in China. The Spear of Funche, the spear used by Gozhen's arch-rival King Fuji in Wu in China. We have the Amanoko Spear of Izagni and Izami, the creator gods of the Japanese mythology. The Gungnir Spear of Odin, famous god of Norse. The Trishula, the Spear of Shiva, the Hindu god whose spear was also cooled in water. Kali of Hinduism, known as the Destroyer, and the goddess of change and rebirth. Despite an overwhelmingly evil reputation, it's considered beautiful and a symbol of feminine strength. Rudra, who is symbiotically connected to Shiva. The version appearing in Book 13 of the Anusasana Parvan of the Mahabharata is considered to be the kernel, the canon version of this tradition, although itself there are 8 variants to the story. Shiva also has what is known as Dasha Sanas Ranamas, those who are known by 10,000 names, and they are found in the Mahanyasa. Rudra is closely connected with Shiva, and is likely considered to be the same person. But then again, having a god with 10,000 names, you can probably understand why. It's been accepted as being a long time that these are the same person. However, Rudra is not Shiva. In the script of the Rigveda, it is said that he was an archer of fire, and his Trishula was given to Kali, who was a consort of Shiva. And these abilities were not of the gods themselves, they were transcended between each other, meaning the tool that has the ability, not the person. And this is a trait found across the world of the gods regardless of area. These trident, these spears, have a commonality of attributes: fire, lightning, causing the earth to tremble, even levitation. One can surmise it wasn't godly power, it wasn't the being themselves, it was in fact their tools, their technology. And that's why it's magic, which leads to some fundamental questions about history and development. It may come as a surprise, we can actually chart the progress from ancient times until at least the early 20th century of a particular staff of the gods. An amazing piece of information comes to light of the Staff of Great Power, and that is a particular artifact here that is known as the Staff and Scepter of Eden. And Shabbataka of Egypt. Shabbataka was in possession of the Staff of Eden, which he then used to rule over Egypt and Kush from 602 BC to 690 BC. And featured in all the wall art of Shabbataka is him always being with this, because it was the source of his godlike powers, and that so much so that he believed himself to be a god. The next user of in the records of a staff attributing to these powers is Alexander the Great. Until he was poisoned in Italy in 323 BC, the particular staff comes to light in biblical times as the staff of John the Baptist, who in the Jewish texts claim that he was a prophet because he held the staff of Eden. Passed to St. Peter, who was the early establisher of the Christian faith and became the first pope. The staff has then followed the lines of the popes until 1492, where it did disappear from historical records. And then in 1888, Tsar Nicholas III claimed possession of the staff. Alexander III is then passed to his son, Tsarevich Nicholas II, who was the Tsar who invited Grigory Rasputin because of his knowledge of the occult, the esoteric, amongst other things. And in 1907, they claim that the staff was missing. This time, it was a time during that Rasputin had returned to Siberia, where he spent 3 times there. He died through some quite nefarious and underhanded means, which have helped propel him into infamy. Now, in 1917, Nikolai Orlov claimed and learned of this staff being in Rasputin's possession, had the body of Rasputin's body exhumed to recover a strange shard that apparently he was buried with. In 1888, the same year that Alexander publicly claimed that he had that miraculous object, Nikolai Orlov attacked and derailed the royal train in Petrograd in an attempt to kill the Tsar, and he was put in jail for 10 years. Bizarrely, his life was spared, considering he tried to kill the leader of a country. It was suggested that he was in fact connected to the Vatican. And today, where does this Trident spear information leave us in our bearing in our talk? Really, it's just to illustrate that these tools are a key constant in our world, as we have seen. Many are described as carrying the same characteristics. This type of tool is not isolated. There are many. They give the user, whether the figure of an apparent deity or an individual who inherits them by other means, the power is literally of the gods. We should be looking at our history from a different perspective on what our ancestors store and recorded, because they are no less intelligent than what we are today. They just lacked the diverse terminology to describe what it was that they were experiencing or what they were seeing. Macmannan, the patron god of the Tuatha Dé Danann, was the sea god Macmannan Mac Lir. The island they came from, Tiernorog, was also known as Macmannan's Island. If we read the descriptions of the sea god Macmannan, firstly he was a god of the sea, who took this role up from his father, the god Lir. Macmannan owns a golden spear, a trident, known as the Catastrophic, which literally means gold tree trident, and his story is told in the fate of the children of Lir and the Tainbo Colin. He controls a golden chariot that is drawn by magical horses, made of metal, which foam the water as he rides over the sea. In the scriptures on the Libar Gabara Eren, there is an extended title where he is greeting Morrigan. In a statement of who he is, and likely are his titles, he is greeted as Macmannan Mac Lir Neptune. Neptune, interestingly, has another connotation, as that is the Greek god Poseidon, and his Roman title is Neptune. So, here we are looking at Macmannan Mac Lir Neptune. Is it possible that we could identify him closely with Poseidon, perhaps even one and the same person? There's a few other connections too. In the Argonautica of the crew, and I quote from page 12, because it literally speaks for itself, there is Amy Morrigan, daughter of Danu, married to Poseidon. Confused? Well, confuzzled, surely. Unfortunately, over the centuries, much has been misinterpreted, misunderstood, interpreted, based on religious attempts to marry things together, as well as progressive language and character changes, as poor translations due to things like lack of resources and personal interpretations. Like the person Bridget, who became St. Bridget during Celtic Christianity, was developing, and also where Anna and Danann and Morrigan have become intermixed. The Libar de Gabara Ellen is the first step to see where these confusions started. It does take some time. It does take time to explaining, which we don't really have the time to cover here right now. But I will refer you to the scholarly work of Mary Jones, 2009, who went to deal of painstaking research in her conclusions. It's highly readable, and that is recommended. It's about 2 pages long. You can find that online. It's listed in the sources below. And for those that are interested in the origins of Celtic deities, genealogies, untangling of words, let's look back at Macmannan Mac Lir Neptune Poseidon link. So in Greek history, according to Plato, or Critias' description of Atlantis in the work of Timaeus, we discover that Atlantis is Poseidon's island, Macmannan's island. This is where the similarities begin. From where the gods split the earth into their own domains, described at the centre of the city of Atlantis was a temple dedicated to Poseidon. The capital city was a marvel of architecture and engineering. The city was comprised of a series of concentric walls and canals. In the very centre was a hill. On the top of the hill was a temple dedicated to Poseidon, and inside was a gold statue of the god of the sea with a 6-winged horse, or 6 horses with wings. Also, the land itself was split into regions, each tended by a son of Poseidon. In Tuatha we find the same description of an area split into 4 regions, each with a major developed city. Let's look at a further visual connection. Catastrophic, now called the Hill of Tara. Remember, this is where Tuatha brought the Leophile from Jerusalem and married the High King of Ireland. Now, in the city of Atlantis, according to the Timaeus, it is claimed to be composed of a number of rings, and in the centre was a hill with Poseidon's temple atop. In Ireland there is a legend. It says the ancestors built the mound on the Hill of Tara to resemble the city centre of Tuatha. Strangely, it does indeed resemble the city of rings of the Atlantean city structure, one and the same. A powerful piece of supporting evidence in regards to all this is in the Greek texts. When we talk about Poseidon, he is always greatly connected with alchemy, metallurgy, crafting, and smithing, done by the Talkenes, a race of small people, very stocky in build, not gods, but more like human beings, with a highly developed, unique skill. When they put on a metal head, it allows them to breathe underwater, like fish. Which is why in the artwork we often see depicted as them being half human and half fish. The Talkenes are also described as creating the bronze statues of the gods of Olympus, which are still there today that we stand in awe of. We also know that the Talkenes are not stuff of myth. They actually did exist. Numerous excavations have turned up dozens of remains, confirmed by Richard Rader, senior lecturer of the UCLA Department of Classics and Archaeology, often buried in heavy set armour plating, usually with axes and short swords. So short, stocky, with vast skills in metallurgy and smithing, which also gives us an interesting mental image. Anyone with a knowledge of fantasy, such as Lord of the Rings, will know exactly what we're describing here. We know from the Greek stories that Talkenes made the Trident of Poseidon, although this is sometimes attributed to being made by the Cyclops. In Ireland, and in particular Scotland, there are stories and legends full of characters who are small in stature with a knowledge of metalwork. And this is where we get the legend of the dwarves, warrior-like people clad in armour and axes with knowledge of metallurgy, and alchemy, crafting and smithing. Now, do you remember Morphesia of Tuatha, who we spoke of earlier, who created the Cathan Bood, known as Macmannan's Trident spear? Well, have a guess how Morphesia is described in the Irish texts of the Libar de Hudri. Exactly the same. There is a picturesque place that lies 9 miles east of Carlisle, 2 miles south of Brampton, and on the Castle Carrock Road. There is a 65-acre lake set amidst 180 acres of farmland, woodland, and there's extensive caves nearby. This area is steeped in stories and superstitions of goblins, dwarves, people who lived in the caves, underground rumblings, and not to mention strange encounters of unworldly kind. Now, should we reveal the name of this park? This park is called Talkenes Country Park, named for the creatures who apparently came out of the ground there. Which does lend support to the fact that it might be that Atlantis and Tuatha are one and the same. Of course, there's a key problem. It's what island? The Irish, and in the text locate Tuatha as being in the northern islands of the world, which we can at least logically surmise and attribute at least to being in the northern hemisphere. More specifically, they locate the land of Og as being off the west coast of Ireland and extending northward. When Tir Atlantis' catastrophe sunk in beneath the waves, the survivors sailed to Ireland, this being the nearest and highest landmass, and they must have approached from the north and then headed east, landing also in Scotland, likely to the mountains. So let's take a moment, collect our thoughts, and put ourselves back on the evidence track. As the obvious question has to be, northwest of Ireland, an island. There is no island. Surely an island so rich, vast, and powerful enough to build a sea fleet to the content of which Plato has put forth as being of Atlantis, are the legends and tales of Tir Narog. Let's have a quick zoom of this map. No island. What island? However, recent satellite images from NASA, used like for the likes of Google Earth, Whirlwind, and Live Earth, reveal this. Now, northwest of the coast of Ireland, there's a substantial island. However, it's underwater. This mass is only 80 metres below the surface of the Atlantic, and what is important here is to know you can see the continental shelf, where land was once above water, and you can see how the plains across the North Sea, the Irish Sea, the English Channel extended outwards, where it demonstrates that where, at least at a time in our history, there was a much lower water level. What is where you can see the range of islands here. This range of islands can be associated with what we refer to today as the Faroe Islands, which we'll come back to shortly. Could these be the tips in the mountain range of Tir Narog, Atlantis, as they do indeed peek out of the sea in this very area? The Faroe Islands, which have now become the world's newest nation, they have separated themselves from Denmark in 2012, and although many of the Faroe Island families are indeed Norse and the Viking invaders and settlers during the 1000s, the history of their people is quite clear. In fact, there's a documentary about them on YouTube, and the link for that is below. That they came across the seas from Macmannan Island. If you look at the Google map, there really does appear to be a large sunken island in this location. This very well could be Tir Narog. The picture demonstrates a larger landmass also around the United Kingdom and Ireland, where, of course, we were connected geographically to the rest of continental Europe. Now, the BBC filmed a documentary which aired on BBC Two. That I can remember it was in the vein of like a Country Farm Each Time team. It was on a Saturday morning. It was like 6 o'clock in the morning, and the title unfortunately has eluded me. And it was aired in around 2006 in the summer. There was a geologist, and he was also an archaeologist, and he was demonstrating and showing information and footage of the great sunken prehistoric forests and the remains of ancient settlements and structures that are out of time. That is, they are far older than history records make them out to be, that exist off the southern coast of England, spreading out beyond the Isle of Wight. In fact, there are a number of supporting articles online which are from the BBC and many other sources. So it's a proven scientific fact that the water level rose as much as 125 metres in a very short period of time, and we're talking this happened under a year. Now, ancient texts and scribes depict this happening all over the earth, and we can find accounts from it, from everywhere from the Holy Bible to the Epic of Gilgamesh, a history and the story of the Hiking in China, the Ragnarok, the Ethiopian Chronicles of Africa, the Toltec of Mexico, the legends of the Native American civilization known as the Ojibwe, and a record of the mass flood in their history. The Inca also claim that the waters rose for 4 months. Even the Aborigines speak of the Dream Flood that flooded the world. So what is quite clear here is whatever happened was experienced and recorded worldwide. It is disputed, however, as to when this happened, although there is a consensus that it must have happened around 6,000 to 6,500 years ago, as discovered by geologists conducting research in the Grand Canyon in relation to this concur with this, with an estimated time of 6,000 to 6,500 years ago, but they weren't looking for water. They instead were looking at rocks, and the Earth confirming that there was indeed a worldwide rise in temperature of around 6 to 7 degrees in 1 year. So could this be, as it is highly likely to suppose, that this is cause and effect in motion? Sensibly, one can say if there was a worldwide temperature rise, thus the ice melts, and thus we have a worldwide rapid rising of water. And to briefly go into what would cause that, the melting of the ice which covered northern Europe is a clear leader. As the water rose, covering the mountains and the inhabitants of other countries, this would explain why there are numerous underwater ruins, cities, ports and forests that lie off the coast of many countries. How this has happened is also written into the text of history, but that would be a different rabbit hole of speculation. However, on the factual note, according to research and white papers published by Wolf G.W. in his book The History of Ireland in Maps, which is available online, and Dr. R. Devoy in his journal paper Sea Level Changes in Ireland, Technology Island, Volume 22, Number 5, the Scandinavian ice sheet that covered Europe that began to recede around 12,000 BC. There's a sudden acceleration around 6,500 BC, but what caused that massive acceleration is still a mystery. Your minds are suitably going to be bombarded with a lot of information. It's an ideal time to draw this act to a close. If you like the kind of discussion that we're having today, want to come by and listen to our radio podcast. That is The Rabbit Hole, That Is Reality. You can find us on YouTube, you can find us on iTunes, and you can come by our website at www.rabbitholethatisreality.co.uk, where you can click play, and also you can download any episode as an MP3. So the interests on there cover many bases. We snapshot in the stories that have caught our eye in the news, information that raises eyebrows and questions, and reading stories between the lines, looking at science, technology, discoveries, the environment, as well as history, mysteries, strange tales, and the Fortean. So please feel free to continue the discussion. In fact, come by our social networks. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. You can just find myself, Christian Lander, on Google+, and on Facebook. You can find the Rabbit Hole That Is Reality page on Facebook. And you can follow myself on Twitter at DefineChristian. So thank you for choosing to spend your time with us here today, and we look forward to hearing from you, and we will see you again soon.